Thailand, 1971. The heat pressed down relentlessly on the remote filming location outside Bangkok, where the big boss was being shot under conditions that tested everyone involved. The production was far from glamorous. Long days, minimal shade, equipment overheating, crew members rotating shirts soaked through with sweat. For Bruce Lee, this film was more than a job. It was a return to Asia after Hollywood rejection, a calculated risk meant to prove that his ideas about combat, movement, and realism could carry a film without gimmicks. He wasn't just acting. He was choreographing, correcting angles, adjusting timing, and demanding authenticity from every man who stepped into a fight scene with him. That insistence quietly created tension. Many of the local fighters hired as stunt performers were not actors pretending to fight. They were real combat athletes, boxers, Muay Thai practitioners, men who had fought in rings, not on sound stages. To them, kung fu films were exaggerated fantasies, wire work, camera tricks, dance routines sold as violence. They watched Bruce rehearse with controlled speed and precision, never throwing full power, never showing strain, and they misread calm for weakness. Whispers began during breaks, then jokes, then comments spoken a little too loudly in Thai, assuming Bruce wouldn't understand. By the third week of filming, the skepticism had hardened. A small group of fighters stood off to the side during a rehearsal, arms crossed, watching Bruce demonstrate how an attack should almost land without actually connecting. One of them shook his head openly, another laughed. The tone wasn't hostile yet, but it was dismissive. These were men who believed skill was proven through pain and domination, not restraint. To them, Bruce looked like a director playing martial artist, not someone who could survive a real exchange once choreography disappeared. Bruce noticed everything. He always did, but he didn't react. He finished the rehearsal, corrected a camera angle, spoke briefly with the director, and continued as if nothing had been said. That restraint only fueled the doubts, because to fighters raised on confrontation, silence feels like avoidance, and avoidance to them means the truth is fragile. What none of them understood yet was that Bruce had spent his entire life preparing for moments exactly like this. Not to win arguments, not to dominate rooms, but to demonstrate reality without needing to announce it. And by the time filming wrapped that afternoon, the tension had reached a point where it could no longer remain untested. If you want to see how this moment ends, subscribe and leave a like. What happens next doesn't take long, but it changes everything. When the director finally called the end of the day's shoot, no one rushed to leave. That alone was unusual. Normally, the moment filming wrapped, the crews scattered toward shade, food, or whatever relief they could find from the heat. This time, people lingered. Equipment stayed where it was. Conversations dropped to murmurs. The fighters who had been questioning Bruce earlier remained nearby, no longer joking, now watching him with open curiosity mixed with impatience. What had started as quiet skepticism was turning into something sharper, an unspoken demand for clarity. One of the fighters stepped forward first. He was not the largest, but he carried himself with the ease of someone used to real violence. Years in Thai rings had taught him how to read posture, breathing, intention. He spoke in broken English, loud enough for others to hear. He said Bruce moved well for film, but film wasn't fighting. He said timing changed when punches were real. He said distance collapsed faster when someone wanted to hurt you. A second fighter nodded. A third added that choreography only worked when both men agreed to play along. The implication was clear. Without cameras, without marks on the ground, Bruce's skill would vanish. Bruce listened without interruption. He didn't correct their English. He didn't defend Kung Fu or Jeet Kune Do or anything theoretical. When they finished, he simply asked one question. Do you want to see the difference? That was it. No challenge, no insult. Just an invitation stated so plainly it unsettled them. One of the men laughed and said yes. Now, before excuses could appear. Another suggested rules. Bruce shook his head. No rules. No filming. Just movement. Word spread instantly across the set. Crew members who had been packing up drifted closer. Translators hovered nervously. The director tried to intervene, reminding everyone that Bruce was the star, that injuries would shut the production down. Bruce acknowledged him calmly and said he would control everything. He always did. That confidence wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Eventually, the objections stopped. A loose circle formed on the dirt just beyond the main set, far enough from equipment to avoid damage, close enough that everyone could see. The fighters removed their shirts, stretched, rolled their shoulders. This was familiar territory for them. Informal challenges happened all the time. Ego, reputation, hierarchy. It was how pecking orders were established. Bruce stepped into the circle last. He removed his shirt without ceremony. The reaction was immediate, not admiration, recognition. His body wasn't large, but it was dense, coiled, balanced. There was nothing decorative about it, no excess. Everything looked intentional. The laughter stopped. One fighter asked who would go first. Bruce gestured to any of them. The man who had spoken earlier stepped forward. He took a Muay Thai stance, light on his feet, relaxed but ready. Bruce didn't mirror him. He stood naturally, hands loose, weight centered. To the onlookers it looked wrong, like someone forgetting to prepare. The fighter mistook that stillness for an opening. He attacked. The first strike came fast. A low kick meant to test balance, not finish the fight. It was the kind of opening Muay Thai fighters used instinctively, designed to bruise the leg and establish control. Bruce checked it without effort, his shin lifting just enough to absorb and redirect the impact. Before the fighter's foot had fully returned to the ground, Bruce was already inside the space the kick created, not rushing, not lunging, simply arriving where the fighter didn't expect anyone to be. A short, straight punch landed against the chest, not full power, not theatrical, just enough to disrupt breathing and structure. The effect was immediate. The fighter staggered half a step back, eyes widening in surprise. That punch hadn't looked like much, but it felt like running into a wall. The fighter adjusted, anger replacing curiosity. He surged forward with a combination, hands high, elbows tight, the rhythm of the ring in his movement. Bruce slipped the punches by inches, his head barely moving, his feet gliding instead of stepping. To the onlookers, it didn't look dramatic. There were no big evasions, no spinning counters, just absence. Every strike passed through space where Bruce had been a fraction of a second earlier. Then Bruce touched him again, this time to the shoulder, guiding momentum, turning the fighter's own force against his balance. A simple sweep followed, not violent, not forceful, just timed perfectly. The fighter hit the dirt hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Silence rippled through the circle. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. There was supposed to be resistance, a scramble, pride-fueled escalation. Instead, the exchange had collapsed before it could become a fight. The fighter pushed himself up quickly, embarrassed but not injured, insisting on continuing. Bruce nodded once. The second exchange was shorter than the first. Another entry, another attempt to impose pressure, another effortless redirection. A palm strike stopped just short of the face, close enough that everyone could see the precision, close enough that no one doubted what would have happened if Bruce hadn't chosen restraint. The remaining fighters exchanged looks. This was no longer about testing an actor. This was about understanding what they were witnessing. One of them stepped in next, heavier than the first, more aggressive. He tried to close distance fast, hoping to smother whatever timing Bruce was using. It didn't work. Bruce angled out, used a brief clinch to off-balance him, then released before it could turn messy. The message was unmistakable. He wasn't there to dominate. He was there to demonstrate control, and control, once established, ended the discussion far more effectively than violence ever could. By the time the third fighter hesitated, the outcome was already clear. No one was injured. No one was humiliated publicly, but something fundamental had shifted. The idea that Bruce's skill belonged only to cameras had evaporated. What stood in its place was something harder to accept, a realization that real fighting didn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looked calm. Sometimes it ended before anyone understood how. Bruce stepped back, signaling the end without saying a word. The fighters nodded, some respectfully, some still catching their breath, all of them recalibrating. The set remained silent for several seconds longer than necessary. Then people began to move again. Not with excitement, not with gossip, but with a subdued awareness that they had just witnessed something real, something unplanned, something that couldn't be dismissed. What lingered after the movement stopped was not embarrassment, but gravity. The fighters who had questioned Bruce earlier no longer stood with crossed arms or restless feet. They stood still, absorbing what their instincts had not prepared them for. In the rings where they trained, dominance was established through damage, through attrition, through forcing another man to break. What they had just experienced didn't follow that logic. Bruce hadn't tried to overpower them. He hadn't tried to intimidate them. He had simply removed their options. Every entry they relied on collapsed before it could mature. Every advantage they trusted, strength, toughness, conditioning, had been made irrelevant by timing and position. That realization sat heavier than any punch. One of the fighters finally spoke, quieter now, asking how Bruce had known when they would move. Bruce answered without mystique. He explained that fighters reveal themselves before they strike, through weight shifts, breath changes, tension in the shoulders, the rhythm of the feet. He said that power comes late, but information comes early, and whoever learns to read the early signals controls the exchange. He emphasized that what they practiced in Muay Thai was real and dangerous, but optimized for a ring, for rules, for predictable ranges. Outside of that context, the fight belonged to whoever adapted faster. Style, he said, was a tool, not a shield. The director, who had watched the entire exchange with growing unease, finally exhaled. Production could continue. Bruce was uninjured. No damage had been done, but something had changed permanently. From that moment forward, no one on set referred to Bruce as the actor. He became the reference point. When fight scenes were planned, the Thai fighters listened. When Bruce adjusted choreography, no one questioned why. They had seen what happened when movement stopped being cooperative. They understood now that restraint was not weakness. It was confidence backed by capability. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on set transformed. The same fighters who had mocked Bruce began training with him during breaks, short sessions, no audience, no challenges, just learning. Bruce absorbed their knowledge of clinch work, elbows and conditioning. In return, he shared footwork, interception, economy of motion. The exchange was mutual, respectful, and quiet. There was no rematch, no escalation, no need. The point had already been proven in under a minute. By the time filming on The Big Boss wrapped, the story had already begun to spread, softened, exaggerated, reshaped by retelling. Some said Bruce had knocked a champion unconscious. Others claimed it was a brutal brawl. Those who were actually there corrected them when they could. They said it wasn't violent, it was decisive. And that distinction mattered because violence fades quickly in memory, precision does not. Years later, when members of that crew were asked about Thailand, about the Big Boss, about the heat and the long days and the film that changed Bruce Lee's life, many of them would hesitate before answering. Not because they didn't remember, but because they remembered too clearly. They remembered the moment when doubt stopped being theoretical, when speculation collapsed into experience, when men who had built their identities on toughness realized they had mistaken endurance for understanding. No one talked about bruises. No one talked about winners and losers. They talked about how quickly it ended, and how quietly. Bruce never referenced the encounter publicly. There were no interviews, no anecdotes meant to elevate his reputation. He didn't need to. The men who mattered already knew. They had felt it in their balance, in the sudden absence of control, in the split second where their training offered no answer. What Bruce demonstrated on that dusty Thai set wasn't superiority of one style over another. It was the danger of rigidity. The cost of believing that any single system, no matter how effective in its environment, was complete. That lesson stayed with those fighters long after filming ended. Some returned to the ring and fought the same way as before, but with quieter confidence. Others changed their training entirely, integrating movement, interception, and adaptability in ways that hadn't existed in their routines before. All of them carried the same unspoken understanding. Real skill doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself only when challenged, and even then, only briefly. When The Big Boss premiered in October 1971 and shattered box office records across Asia, audiences saw Bruce Lee explode onto the screen as something new, faster, sharper, more real than anything martial arts cinema had shown before. What they didn't see was that the realism wasn't an illusion. It was restraint. It was control refined to the point where violence became optional. Those who had stood in that circle in Thailand knew the difference. They had seen what happened when choreography ended and reality began. And that is why the story endured. Not because it was filmed, not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't need embellishment. Bruce Lee didn't prove himself by defeating fighters. He proved himself by making the fight unnecessary the moment it truly began.